Welcome to Marple Whispers. I'm Sean. Tell me, where are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? I'd love to know. Share it in the comments along with how you liked the story. I reply to every single one of you. Now let's step into the mystery. On a quiet English village morning, a young groom is found dead, drowned in the very lake where he was meant to celebrate his wedding night. Was it a tragic accident or something far darker? Behind the widow's composed tears and the polished shoes left by the water lies a secret, a hidden identity, a bitter argument, and a meticulously planned deception. Now, one sharp-eyed detective must unravel the lies, the subtle clues, and the shadows of the past to uncover the truth. Welcome to Willowmere House, where nothing is as it seems, and every smile hides a story. Chapter 1. Bells, Roses, and a Sudden Silence. The bells of St. Aldwyn's rang with a confidence that suggested nothing in the world could possibly go wrong. They pealed across Wickham Parva in bright, orderly waves, echoing off hedgerows and red-brick cottages, summoning villagers who had not entered the church in years but would not miss this wedding for anything. Miss Jane Marple arrived precisely 5 minutes early, as she always did. She wore her dove-grey coat, her best straw hat trimmed with faded violets, and an expression of mild, almost abstract interest. Weddings, she had observed over the years, encourage people to behave unnaturally, either far too kind or far too honest. The church was crowded. Mrs. Finch's roses overflowed the chancel, their sweetness almost oppressive, while whispers travelled like draughts along the pews. "He's very handsome," they say. Too handsome, if you ask me. And rich, bought Willowmere outright. Can you imagine? Miss Marple listened without appearing to do so. She was far more interested in how these things were said than what was said. Admiration often carried an edge, envy always did. When the groom entered, there was a perceptible stir. Oliver Grant cut an impressive figure, tall, dark-haired, his smile confident without warmth. Miss Marple noticed how easily his eyes travelled the congregation, measuring, assessing. It reminded her of a man who once came to St. Mary Mead, selling investment opportunities, and left behind 3 ruined widows. Lydia Marsh followed on her father's arm, glowing in ivory satin. Yet Miss Marple saw at once what others did not. Lydia's smile was too controlled, her steps slightly hesitant, as though she were walking towards something she had already argued with and lost. At the exchange of rings, Lydia's fingers trembled. Oliver tightened his grip just a fraction longer than necessary. A small thing, of course, very small. The ceremony proceeded faultlessly. Vows were spoken, promises were made with a confidence Miss Marple had learned never to trust. Applause followed them down the aisle, spilling into laughter and relieved sighs. Outside, the sun shone obligingly. Confetti rained. Photographs were taken again and again, until Lydia's smile hardened at the edges and Oliver's patience thinned. "Come along, my dear," he murmured once, sharply enough for Miss Marple, standing quite near to hear. The reception at Willowmere House was everything Wickham Parva expected and more. Long tables, polished silver, champagne flowing far too freely. The lake beyond the lawn lay smooth as glass, reflecting lantern light and celebration alike. Miss Marple sat with her teacup and watched. She saw Oliver drink more than was wise. She saw Lydia refuse a dance. She saw a brief, intense exchange between bride and groom near the terrace doors. Faces close, voices low, expressions anything but affectionate. At midnight, guests began to drift away. Laughter faded. Lanterns were extinguished one by one. Miss Marple, helped into her coat, paused before leaving. She glanced once more toward the lake. The moon had risen, pale and watchful. It occurred to her, without knowing why, that the night felt unfinished. By morning, the bells would ring again. But not for a wedding. Chapter 2. A Lake That Keeps Secrets Morning came to Willowmere House with an air of indecent calm. The sun lay gently upon the lawns, the birds sang as though nothing at all had happened, and the lake beyond the beech trees gleamed like a polished mirror. To Miss Jane Marple, such serenity was always suspicious. Nature, she had long observed, had a dreadful habit of being at its most beautiful when human affairs were at their worst. The news reached her just after breakfast. Mrs. Bantry telephoned, breathless, excited and deeply shocked. "Jane, my dear, something simply awful has happened. The groom, Oliver Grant, he's been found in the lake." Miss Marple paused, her teacup halfway to her lips. "Found?" she repeated mildly. "Yes, dead, drowned, they say, on his wedding night. Poor Lydia." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "How very unfortunate." She replaced the cup carefully on its saucer. The word unfortunate, she reflected, was one people used far too freely when they did not yet understand what had occurred. Within the hour, Wickham Parva was alive with movement. Villagers who rarely hurried anywhere now rushed in small, purposeful groups toward Willowmere House. Miss Marple joined them at a measured pace, her mind already arranging small observations from the night before into neat mental compartments. The body had been removed by the time she arrived. Nevertheless, the atmosphere hung heavy, like the lingering echo of a scream. The lawn near the lake was crowded with murmuring figures. Mrs. Finch clasping her hands, Mr. Aldridge frowning thoughtfully, and several young men looking both thrilled and appalled by the proximity of tragedy. Inspector Hale stood near the water's edge, notebook in hand. He was a solid, capable man with an expression that suggested impatience with speculation and a fondness for facts. "A dreadful business," he said, addressing no one in particular, "but accidents do happen." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "they do." The lake itself looked utterly harmless. It sloped gently, the water barely waist-deep for several yards from the bank. Miss Marple had been told, many times, that children learned to swim there before they learned to write their names. "Drunk, most likely," Inspector Hale continued. "Wedding celebrations, emotions running high. A man steps too close, slips, and that's that." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to a pair of men placing a small evidence marker near the shore. Something lay beside it. "Oh," she said, "and what are those?" "His shoes," the inspector replied briskly. "Left neatly by the water. Sensible chap, really. Didn't want to get them wet." Miss Marple knitted her brows. How thoughtful of him. The shoes were polished, expensive, and most notably, entirely dry. She said nothing further. Experience had taught her that questions asked too early often hardened into resistance. Lydia Grant remained inside the house. She was, according to Mrs. Aldridge, quite overcome and unable to speak to anyone. Miss Marple accepted this without comment, though she privately wondered how many women would find themselves capable of anything at all after losing a husband so abruptly. Late in the morning, Inspector Hale requested to speak with several guests who had stayed overnight. Miss Marple found herself seated in the drawing-room, sunlight filtering through lace curtains, as he asked her routine questions. "You left the reception at what time, Miss Marple?" "Just after 11, she replied. "I find late nights rather tiring." "Did you notice anything unusual?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Unusual is such a relative term, Inspector. but I did observe that Mr. Grant appeared restless. Restless? Yes, as though he were not inclined to settle into the role of contented bridegroom." Inspector Hale scribbled something down. "And Mrs. Grant?" Miss Marple hesitated, only a fraction of a second. She seemed very controlled. The inspector raised an eyebrow. "You think that's odd?" "I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that people express emotion in different ways. Some of them rather more carefully than others." By noon the village verdict was already forming. Most agreed it had been a tragic accident. A few suggested suicide, though no one could quite explain why a man newly married and apparently prosperous would choose such a moment. Miss Marple strolled toward the lake once more, this time alone. She stood where the shoes had been found and looked out across the water. The surface rippled slightly in the breeze, betraying nothing. A memory stirred, of a boy from her childhood village who had been found in a mill pond. Everyone had insisted he slipped. Only later did it emerge that someone had pushed him during a quarrel over money. Human nature, she reflected, rarely changed its habits. Near the boathouse, she noticed something else. A faint disturbance in the mud, as though someone had struggled briefly before losing balance. It was subtle, easily overlooked by anyone not accustomed to looking for what did not quite belong. Miss Marple returned to the house as voices rose inside. Inspector Hale emerged, rubbing his temples. "The widow insists her husband went for a walk to clear his head," he said to no one in particular. "She was asleep when he left." "Was she?" Miss Marple murmured. The inspector looked at her sharply. "You doubt it?" "I merely observe," she said, "that sleep is a very convenient explanation." He gave a short laugh. "You sound like you expect foul play." "I expect," said Miss Marple, "that when something appears too neat, it very often is." As the afternoon wore on, the official tone remained calm, reasonable, and faintly dismissive of anything more sinister than misadventure. Yet Miss Marple felt a distinct tightening of certainty. A man had died in a lake that did not kill easily. His shoes had been placed with care. His marriage, so celebrated the night before, had already begun to reveal cracks. A lake that peaceful, she thought, must work very hard to keep its secrets. And secrets, Miss Marple knew, had a most unfortunate habit of surfacing. Chapter 3. The Widow's Tears. The curtains in Lydia Grant's bedroom were drawn back just enough to admit a thin, flattering light. It softened the room, lending it an air of restrained sorrow, precisely the sort of sorrow one expected to find in a house newly acquainted with death. Miss Jane Marple, invited up by Mrs. Aldridge with many whispered apologies, took careful note of everything as she entered. Lydia lay upon the bed, propped against embroidered pillows, her dark hair loose about her shoulders. She wore a pale dressing gown that suggested fragility without sacrificing elegance. Her eyes were red, her voice faint. To the casual observer she was grief-stricken. Miss Marple had learned long ago that grief, like illness, had many imitations. "My dear Mrs. Grant," she said gently, taking the offered chair, "we were all so terribly shocked." Lydia turned her face toward her visitor. Tears welled at once, though they fell sparingly, as if carefully rationed. "It doesn't seem real," she murmured. "One moment I was a bride, the next this." A pause followed. Miss Marple filled it by unfolding her gloves and placing them neatly on her lap. "Inspector Hale tells me," Lydia continued, "that it must have been an accident. Oliver had been drinking. He was upset." "Upset?" Miss Marple prompted kindly. "Yes, Weddings are exhausting, aren't they? He said he needed air to think. Her voice broke, and she pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. Miss Marple noticed quite distinctly that the handkerchief remained dry. "Did you hear him leave?" she asked. "No, I was asleep, completely asleep." "Ah," said Miss Marple, "you are fortunate to have such a sound constitution." Lydia looked at her sharply, then away. "I suppose I am." Mrs. Aldridge hovered near the door, her expression taut with loyalty. "Poor dear hasn't slept a wink since," she said. "Not properly." Miss Marple smiled at her. "One never does after such shocks." Downstairs, the house felt different, stripped of last night's gaiety, reduced to echo and unease. Servants moved quietly, speaking in murmurs. Every sound seemed amplified. A teacup placed too firmly, a door closed with unnecessary care. Miss Marple took tea with Mrs. Finch and Mrs. Aldridge in the morning room. Both women were brimming with sympathetic outrage. "Such a gentleman," Mrs. Finch said, "so generous. You know he offered to fund the church roof repairs?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Did he?" Mrs. Finch hesitated. "Well, he said he intended to." Intentions, Miss Marple reflected, were often cheaper than actions. "And Lydia?" she asked. "Oh, she adored him," Mrs. Aldridge insisted quickly, "though, of course, they did argue from time to time." "Only natural," said Miss Marple. "May I ask what they argued about?" Mrs. Aldridge pressed her lips together. "Money, mostly. Mr. Grant had plans, very ambitious plans." Plans. Another word with many interpretations. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple encountered young Peter Collins loitering near the gates. His cheeks were flushed with excitement. "Miss Marple," he said eagerly, "I heard voices last night, near the lake." "Did you?" she said mildly. "Yes, a man and a woman. Sounded angry." "And yet you told no one?" He shuffled his feet. "Didn't think it mattered then." Miss Marple thanked him kindly. Experience had taught her that youthful witnesses often improved their recollections with encouragement and time. Back inside the house, Inspector Hale was conducting another round of questioning. His tone remained professional, but there was a faint edge to it now. "Mrs. Grant," he said, "you mentioned an argument. What was it about?" Lydia's lips trembled. "He was irritated. He said I embarrassed him, that I'd been distant. Did he threaten to leave?" "No," she said it too quickly. "He just went for a walk." Miss Marple watched her closely. Lydia's face had flushed, not with grief, but with something sharper. Later, alone in the drawing-room, Miss Marple studied a small table by the window. Upon it lay a silver-framed photograph of Lydia and Oliver, taken earlier that day. Lydia smiled stiffly. Oliver's arm encircled her shoulders, not protectively, Miss Marple thought, but possessively. A memory stirred of a woman in St. Mary Mead, who once claimed devotion to a husband she secretly despised. That woman, too, had cried at all the right moments. By evening, the house was heavy with suspicion, though no one would yet name it. The villagers' sympathy had begun to thin, replaced by curiosity sharpened into something more pointed. Miss Marple took her leave just before dusk. As she stepped onto the path, she glanced back at the upstairs window. Lydia stood there, watching the drive. For an instant, her expression was not sorrowful. It was calculating. Miss Marple sighed softly. Tears, she reflected, were among the most misleading things in the world. Some washed sorrow away. Others were applied, like powder, to conceal it. And somewhere beneath the widow's careful display lay the truth, waiting patiently to be uncovered. Chapter 4. A bracelet, a boat, and a bitter smile. By the 4th day after Oliver Grant's death, Wickham Parva had reached that delicate stage where sympathy curdles into speculation. Curtains twitched more openly now. Conversations paused when someone entered the room. Miss Jane Marple, moving quietly through it all, recognized the pattern perfectly. It was the same in every village, tragedy first, then judgment. She returned to Willowmere House that afternoon, under the perfectly respectable excuse of delivering a small pot of quince jelly to the bereaved widow. It was the sort of gesture no one ever questioned, and it allowed Miss Marple to observe without appearing to do so. Lydia Grant received her in the morning room. She looked thinner, paler, and more composed than before. Grief, Miss Marple noted, was settling into a shape Lydia found manageable. "That is very kind of you," Lydia said, accepting the jar. "I hardly know how I'm managing without Oliver." Miss Marple sat, folding her hands. "One does what one must," she said gently. There was a pause, one of those pauses that begged to be filled. Lydia filled it. "I suppose everyone thinks it was my fault," she said quietly. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Do they? They must. People always look for someone to blame." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "though sometimes they look in the wrong direction." Lydia's eyes flickered, just briefly, to her wrist. Miss Marple followed the movement at once. It was a pretty bracelet, delicate gold links, recently polished. Miss Marple had a sharp eye for such things, having once uncovered a theft purely on the basis of a repaired clasp. "That is charming," she remarked. "A wedding gift." Lydia hesitated. "No, I've had it for years. It broke the other night. Oliver was annoyed. He disliked carelessness." "Ah," said Miss Marple, "it has been repaired." "Yes, the jeweller came yesterday." Miss Marple smiled. "How fortunate that you noticed the break." Lydia's smile tightened. "One notices such things." Miss Marple rose soon after, thanking her hostess and drifting out toward the grounds. She had no intention of leaving just yet. The lake lay ahead, deceptively peaceful. Sunlight danced upon the surface, disguising its recent role in death. Miss Marple approached the boathouse slowly, her sensible shoes sinking slightly into the softened earth. It was there that she saw them again. The marks in the mud had not entirely faded. They were subtle now, blurred by time and weather, but still visible to someone who knew how to look. Two sets of footprints, one deeper, more abrupt, as though someone had stumbled or been shoved. Miss Marple bent slightly, peering closer. The second set curved sharply toward the water, ending in a smear. A faint metallic scrape caught her attention. She turned toward the rowing boat drawn up beside the boathouse. On its side, just above the waterline, was a thin scratch, fresh, careless, and unmistakable. A bracelet clasp, perhaps? Human beings, Miss Marple reflected, were very fond of underestimating how much they revealed in moments of anger. Voices interrupted her thoughts. Inspector Hale approached, accompanied by Peter Collins, who looked immensely important. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," the inspector said, "taking an interest in nautical matters?" "Oh, no," she replied pleasantly. "I was merely admiring how tidy everything is." Hale followed her gaze to the boat. "We've checked it. No sign of a struggle." "Not one you'd notice at first glance," Miss Marple said mildly. He studied her for a moment. "You're very interested in details." "One has to be," she replied, "especially when people are very anxious for things to remain simple." Peter Collins cleared his throat. "I told the inspector about the argument," he said eagerly. "Near the lake?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I heard." Inspector Hale frowned. "Trouble is, Arguments don't equal murder. No, Miss Marple agreed, but they often explain it. That evening, the village gathered, as villages do, at Mrs. Finch's shop, where grief was now served with a generous helping of gossip. I always thought she smiled oddly, someone said. Too calm, if you ask me. And that bracelet, have you noticed it? Wearing it every day now. Miss Marple listened, selecting apples with great care. She neither encouraged nor discouraged the talk. People revealed far more when they believed they were speaking freely. Later, she encountered Mrs. Aldridge in the corridor at Willowmere. The housekeeper looked troubled. "Miss Marple," she said in a low voice, "do you really think it was an accident?" Miss Marple considered. "Do you?" Mrs. Aldridge swallowed. "I heard shouting, worse than usual, and something splashed." "A splash?" Miss Marple repeated gently. "Yes, like someone falling." Miss Marple nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Aldridge. That was very brave of you." By nightfall, Inspector Hale's confidence had begun to erode. He returned to the lake with renewed interest, examining the boat more closely, the shoreline more carefully. Miss Marple watched from a little distance, her mind already assembling the pattern. A quarrel, a broken bracelet, a shove, a fall. A man who struck his head and slid into water too shallow to kill, unless he was already unconscious. And afterward? Shoes placed neatly. A story rehearsed. Tears applied where required. As she turned back toward the house, Miss Marple glimpsed Lydia standing at the terrace doors. Their eyes met briefly. Lydia smiled. It was not the smile of a grieving widow. It was a bitter, defiant smile, one that dared the world to prove what it suspected. Miss Marple sighed. That smile, she knew, would be remembered. Bracelets could be repaired, boats could be cleaned, lakes could keep secrets for a time. But human nature, once it revealed itself, never truly went back into hiding. Chapter 5. The past comes ashore. By the 5th day, Willowmere House was a house half empty. Friends of the deceased came and went, offering condolences and discreet inquiries, while villagers whispered behind drawn curtains and in shaded corners of the tea shop. Miss Marple, of course, moved quietly between these currents, collecting details as one might gather shells along a seashore, each one small, unremarkable, yet revealing in its pattern. Inspector Hale had grown increasingly restless. He was a man who preferred facts neatly stacked and motives clearly labelled, yet each new scrap of information complicated his tidy picture. Miss Marple, as ever, observed him with mild curiosity. Practical, energetic, polite, but far too ready to accept the obvious. The morning had begun with a fresh piece of news delivered via telegram, an intrusion into the ordinary rhythm of village life that made Miss Marple's pulse quicken in the most polite way. The telegram was brief, crisp, and explosive. Oliver Grant not who he claims. Real name, Charles Whitford. Fraud, multiple aliases, wanted, verify immediately. Miss Marple read it twice before lowering the paper. That explained several curious things. The vague references to past business ventures, the reticence about family, and the strangely possessive behaviour toward Lydia. Villagers, blissfully ignorant of the financial histories of distant towns, would never have guessed. But Miss Marple had long understood that past sins rarely stayed buried, and that they had an unerring way of resurfacing at the most inconvenient time. A brief walk across the lawn led her to the lake once more. It lay quiet, the surface glassy, betraying nothing. Yet Miss Marple thought the lake had seen much and remembered more. 2 days of careful observation allowed her to detect subtleties. The soft indent of shoes in the mud. A faint drag mark near the boathouse, the scratch upon the boat's side, evidence that spoke louder than words. The telegram had simply given these clues a voice. Inside, Lydia Grant, Charles Whitford she now knew, received visitors with a composure that bordered on eerie. Miss Marple observed from the doorway as Lydia spoke with the solicitor, the tone polite, controlled, unshakable. "You understand," Lydia said, "that I intend to cooperate fully, but the truth is complicated." Miss Marple nodded quietly. Yes, it was indeed complicated. Complicated because human nature rarely submits to a simple narrative. Complicated because greed, anger, fear, and vanity are woven so tightly into the human heart that they become nearly invisible. And complicated because those closest to the event, the participants themselves, often misunderstand their own motives. Late that morning, Inspector Hale sought Miss Marple's counsel, though he would not call it that. "You've been observing this place longer than I have," he admitted, his voice low. "Do you have any theories?" Miss Marple tilted her head, as was her habit. "I have a few possibilities," she said gently, "none of them mutually exclusive. People seldom act alone or predictably, and one cannot ignore the past." "The past?" he asked sharply. "The man was new to the village." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but perhaps not new to mischief." Hale frowned. "You think someone pushed him?" "I am considering," said Miss Marple, "that the lake's calm may have made a convenient stage for old grievances, and that the gentleman himself was not entirely innocent." The inspector blinked. "Explain." "Imagine," Miss Marple said softly, "a man arriving in a village, assuming a new name, marrying for appearances or gain. Imagine his wife, well-born, intelligent, aware of his real identity. How likely is it that a quarrel could remain civil?" Hale considered this, tapping his notebook. Miss Marple had the rare talent of presenting a possibility so plausible that it seemed to fill gaps no one else had noticed. Yet she never insisted. She merely invited reflection. By mid-afternoon, the solicitor left, leaving Lydia alone with Miss Marple. "You understand, Miss Marple," Lydia said, "that the revelations about Oliver to Charles have complicated everything." "I can imagine," said Miss Marple. "Truth rarely makes life easier in the moment." Lydia's eyes darkened. "You don't understand. He married me for my inheritance. He laughed when I confronted him about his identity." Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. Her knitting paused in her lap. "And the argument on your wedding night?" Lydia's hands clenched the armrests. "It was heated. He wanted to leave immediately with the money he believed was rightfully his. I acted in the moment." "And then?" Miss Marple asked softly, though she had already formed an inkling of the outcome. Lydia's voice dropped. "He slipped, or I pushed. I do not know how it happened precisely, only that he struck his head and the water claimed him." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Experience had taught her that in moments of extreme emotion, memory often fractured. People recalled the sequence, but rarely the intention. "And the shoes by the water?" she asked. Lydia's expression shifted slightly. "I placed them there. I wanted it to seem accidental." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Human beings were consistent in their instinct to conceal guilt, yet careless in execution. Shoes neatly positioned, a story rehearsed, small details that unravelled quickly under the weight of scrutiny. "That bracelet," Miss Marple said, glancing at Lydia's wrist. "It caught, did it not?" Lydia's fingers tightened around the edge of her gown. "Yes, on the boat. I had repaired it that morning. I did not intend to harm him." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Intent is a subtle thing, Mrs. Grant. The result, however, is not subtle at all. By the lake later, Miss Marple retraced the sequence in her mind. The argument, the shove, the slip, the strike of the head, the water shallow enough that a struggle could not escape notice, the shoes placed with care, the tale of a gentleman lost to accident. And beneath it all, the past, Charles Whitford's fraudulent identity, his laughter at deception, the long shadow of prior sins. Inspector Hale, now standing beside her, followed her gaze. "You're certain?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Certain of the pattern, yes. Certain of the past coming ashore, absolutely. But certainty about human motives, well, that is rarely as clear as we wish." The sun fell lower, painting the lake with streaks of molten gold. Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of comprehension. The moment when scattered details lock together, revealing a picture that is at once inevitable and astonishing. The past had come ashore indeed, not as waves, but as truth, messy, dangerous, and unavoidable. And somewhere in Willowmere House, a widow sat quietly, her hands clasped over the bracelet on her wrist, her expression resolute. Miss Marple reflected, as she often did, that calm faces could conceal storms, and small hands could unleash consequences far beyond their size. Human nature, she thought, may be predictable, but never entirely kind. It would take time, care, and a certain measure of patience to see justice done. And Miss Marple had both. Chapter 6. Justice, Village Style. By the 6th morning, Willowmere House had settled into an uneasy routine. The household moved quietly, as though aware of the watchful eyes of the village and of the law alike. Servants whispered in corners, their hands trembling as they poured tea, and neighbours passed in polite silence, their expressions carefully neutral. Even the lake seemed more subdued, reflecting the pale morning sun without sparkle, as if it too mourned the sudden absence of Oliver Grant, Charles Whitford, as the telegram had revealed. Miss Jane Marple arrived for her morning walk at a time when the dew still clung to the grass, and the air was crisp with the scent of beech and damp earth. She walked slowly, deliberately, each step measured, as she often did when her mind was occupied with the intricate workings of human nature. Her thoughts naturally drifted toward Lydia Grant. Widow, yes, but now she understood that Lydia's grief had been carefully sculpted, displayed with precision, and largely performative. Inside, Lydia sat in the drawing-room, staring out at the lake. The bracelet, glinting faintly on her wrist, seemed almost a talisman, a signal to anyone who cared to notice that appearances mattered more than emotion. Miss Marple knew that such details were never accidental. Inspector Hale arrived soon after, a man with a fondness for order and a tendency to grow impatient with subtleties. He greeted Miss Marple with a nod, his notebook in hand. "I've been through all the reports again," he said briskly. "Witness statements, telegrams, the coroner's notes. Everything points to an accident." "Accidents are convenient," said Miss Marple mildly, "especially for those who have something to conceal." Hale frowned. "You're implying I am merely considering possibilities," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Human nature is rarely straightforward, and sometimes justice requires noticing things that others prefer to ignore." He followed her gaze toward Lydia, who had just risen and walked to the window, her posture perfect, her expression calm. There was, Miss Marple observed, a tension beneath her control, a tautness that promised action, or at the very least revelation, once the moment came. The village had begun to talk too, in whispers that travelled faster than any official inquiry. Mrs. Finch's flower shop was abuzz with speculation. "She's far too composed," one woman whispered. "No real grief could look like that." She must have known something, another added, or perhaps she made it happen. Miss Marple knew these were the observations that mattered. People often spoke the truth without realizing it, and when enough such whispers accumulated, patterns emerged that no one could ignore. Later that afternoon, the solicitor returned. He had come to finalize legal matters, but his presence stirred the household. Lydia listened politely, agreed to terms, and smiled just enough to appear cooperative. Miss Marple, seated near the window with her knitting, noticed the flicker of defiance in her eyes when the solicitor turned away. That subtle signal confirmed what she had already suspected. Lydia's composure was a performance, and her mind was far from idle. Inspector Hale approached Miss Marple after the meeting. "You've been observing her," he said quietly. "You've seen what I can only guess at." "I have observed," Miss Marple said, "and one cannot ignore what is suggested by the past, nor by small careful actions in the present." Hale sighed. "I suppose you mean the argument, the shoes, the bracelet?" "And more," said Miss Marple. "The way a woman arranges her grief can speak as much as any confession. The timing of her movements, the care with which she handles objects, these are the marks of intent." By evening the matter could no longer be left to speculation. Hale had summoned Lydia for a formal interview, and she entered the room with that same controlled expression. Miss Marple, as always, remained a quiet observer, seated near the doorway with her knitting in her lap. "Mrs. Grant," Hale began, "we have reason to believe that your husband's death may not have been purely accidental." Lydia's composure did not waver. She met his gaze steadily. "I have told you everything I know," she said. "It was an accident." Miss Marple watched carefully as Lydia shifted her hands. She noticed the tension in the fingers, the subtle tightening around the bracelet. It was a gesture of concealment, an unconscious admission that the story was incomplete. "Would you care to tell me about the night of the wedding?" Hale pressed. Lydia's voice was soft but steady. "We had an argument. He wanted to leave immediately. I tried to reason with him." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And the lake? He slipped," Lydia said quickly. "He fell. I tried to help him, but it was too late." "Did anyone else see this?" Hale asked. "No," she said. "I was alone with him. I screamed. I don't know what else to say." Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly. She considered every detail. The telegram revealing his true identity, the argument over money, the broken bracelet, the shallow lake, the shoes placed carefully on the bank. Each piece fit into a larger pattern, one that spoke of both opportunity and motive. After a pause, Lydia added, almost as an afterthought, "I suppose it was the result of anger. Things escalated." Hale frowned. "Are you admitting to having struck him?" "I did not intend to harm him," Lydia said firmly. "It was an accident." Miss Marple allowed a small smile to play at her lips. Human nature, she thought, often framed self-preservation in terms of accident or necessity. It was a pattern repeated countless times in countless villages. Yet, as always, there were traces, small, almost invisible, that revealed the truth to those who knew how to look. The next day Hale returned to the lake for a final inspection. Miss Marple accompanied him, walking slowly along the shore, examining the marks in the mud, the drag along the bank, the scratch on the boat. The evidence, she noted, was subtle but consistent with Lydia's own admission. A brief struggle, a push or shove, a fall, the head striking the boat or the bank, and the subsequent immersion in the shallow, azure water. By now, word had spread through the village, and a small crowd gathered at the edge of the property, curious, sympathetic, and a little gleeful. They watched the inspector and Miss Marple with a mix of expectation and fear, sensing that the truth would soon emerge. When Hale returned to the house, he called Lydia into the drawing room. Miss Marple followed, knowing that the moment of revelation was near. Hale's tone was firm but not unkind. "Mrs. Grant," he said, "it is clear to us now that your husband as he called himself, was not entirely who he claimed. Your actions, in combination with the circumstances, have resulted in his death." Lydia did not flinch. She looked from Hale to Miss Marple, her expression composed, her eyes steady. "I did what I had to do," she said quietly. "He married me for money, for appearances. He laughed when I confronted him about his identity. I did not mean for him to die. But," she paused, "things escalated." Hale nodded. "We understand. The coroner will make his report, and the law will proceed accordingly. But your cooperation is noted, and it will be taken into consideration." Miss Marple rose and folded her knitting. She glanced at Lydia, noting the faint bitter smile that lingered despite the gravity of the situation. It was the smile of one who had exercised agency in a world that had often sought to manipulate her. The villagers, when the news was finally made public, responded with a mixture of shock, relief, and fascination. Justice, in its slow, deliberate way, had arrived, not in the form of scandalous trial or sensational confession, but in the careful recognition of truth, tempered by circumstance and human frailty. Miss Marple reflected, as she often did, that the world rarely offers perfect resolutions. People lie, deceive, act out of fear or anger, and yet the consequences inevitably follow. In Willowmere House, the lake had claimed its victim, the widow had claimed her dignity, and the village had claimed its story. A story that would be told for generations, whispered behind lace curtains, repeated in tea rooms, and analysed endlessly in the comfortable certainty that small villages provide. As she walked back to her own quiet home that evening, Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. Justice, in her experience, was seldom dramatic, seldom perfect, but it was inexorable. And in Willowmere, justice had been served, village-style, quietly, precisely, and with a keen understanding of human nature. And somewhere, in the distance, the lake lay calm once more, its surface reflecting the sky, the trees, and the shadows of past deeds, waiting patiently for the next secret to come ashore. Chapter 7. Tea at 4. The village of St. Aldwyn had returned to its ordinary rhythms, at least on the surface. The shops opened at their usual hours. The postman delivered letters with the same dutiful precision, and the church bells rang at midday and evening without comment or interruption. Yet beneath this ordinary facade lingered the memory of Willowmere House, of Oliver Grant, Charles Whitford, as the papers now cautiously noted, and of the widow who had outwitted circumstance itself. Miss Jane Marple arrived promptly at 4. As she always did. The air was crisp with early winter's promise, and a faint smell of burning leaves drifted from the hedgerows. She carried her small basket of knitting and a loaf of her own soda bread, a gesture that allowed her to enter homes without suspicion and to observe without intrusion. Mrs. Bantry greeted her warmly. "Jane, I'm so glad you're here. Come in, come in. I've just put the kettle on. You must hear the latest from Willowmere." Miss Marple smiled politely, though her mind was already at Willowmere House in thought. "I expect there is always something new, my dear. Human nature has a talent for revelation." The Bantry's drawing-room smelled of strong tea and baked apples, a comfort after days of village tension. Mrs. Bantry poured the tea herself, a ceremonial act that always reminded Miss Marple of the careful choreography of observation and reflection. "You know," Mrs. Bantry began, "it's all very well to say justice was served, but I can't help thinking about Lydia. She's such a composed creature. How does one even begin to comprehend that kind of situation?" Miss Marple sipped her tea with gentle deliberation. Comprehension is not always necessary. Sometimes one must observe, reflect, and allow consequences to unfold. That is often sufficient. "But don't you find it unsettling?" Mrs. Bantry pressed. "To think a young man was found dead under such circumstances, married only a few hours before, and the truth was so complicated." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Unsettling? Perhaps, but predictable. Villages are like small gardens. Patterns repeat, weeds grow in the same places, and flowers bloom at the same season. Human behavior is much the same. The details differ, but the general tendencies remain." Mrs. Bantry shook her head. "You make it sound so ordinary." "It is," said Miss Marple. "Even the extraordinary often has roots in the ordinary." After a pause, Mrs. Bantry leaned closer. "Do you think Lydia truly meant harm?" Miss Marple considered this, setting down her cup. "Intent is a curious thing, my dear. It can be as transient as a shadow. What matters are the consequences and the evidence. In Lydia's case, circumstances escalated. Her actions, whether planned or impulsive, led to a result that is now being properly addressed." A silence fell between them, filled only by the soft ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional chime from the distant church. Outside, the village resumed its quiet life, but the shadow of Willowmere lingered like a faint echo. "Do you ever worry," Mrs. Bantry asked hesitantly, "that people like Lydia might get away with such things, at least morally?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, the expression of one who had spent a lifetime observing the balance of justice. "Moral judgment is not the same as legal judgment. We may feel that some actions are regrettable, but the law considers evidence, circumstance, and motive. That is why observation is so important. One sees what others overlook, and the truth, though delayed, usually emerges." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened slightly. "So you think Willowmere is settled?" "Yes, for now," Miss Marple said. "But life rarely remains perfectly settled. People forget details, but places remember. The lake will recall the events that occurred on its banks, and the house will hold the memory of the night forever. Those memories shape behavior, even unconsciously. Lydia will carry hers, and the village will carry theirs." The conversation shifted naturally, as tea always encourages, to the minor scandals and joys of St. Aldwyn. A new baker in the village, a missing cat, a minor dispute over the hedgerows along Chapel Lane. Yet beneath the casual chatter, Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, arranging the threads of recent events into a tapestry she could understand fully. When the clock struck 4:30, she rose to leave, smoothing her coat and adjusting her hat. "Thank you for tea, my dear. It has been a pleasure to visit." Mrs. Bantry walked her to the door. "Jane, how do you always see so much without seeming to notice anything?" Miss Marple gave a faint, knowing smile. "One observes as a habit. Everything reveals itself in time, even the smallest action. Placing shoes by a lake, adjusting a bracelet, can speak volumes. One simply must have patience." Outside, the air was cooler, tinged with the scent of frost on fallen leaves. Miss Marple paused at the gate, looking down the lane toward Willowmere. The house was distant but visible, the lake beyond it still quiet, reflecting the pale winter sky. It seemed almost innocent, Yet she knew better. That lake and the house behind it would never again be free of memory. She walked on slowly, her thoughts tracing the events of the past week. She thought of Oliver Grant, or rather Charles Whitford, the man whose life had ended so suddenly, of Lydia, whose carefully maintained composure had concealed so much, and of the village, which had observed, speculated, and ultimately played its part in the unfolding of justice. Miss Marple reflected on the nature of truth. It was rarely immediate, rarely obvious, and rarely comfortable. Yet she had seen it revealed through small details, human inconsistencies, and the inexorable march of consequences. Justice, she knew, was not always dramatic, but it was persistent. And in Willowmere it had been realized, however quietly. As she reached her own gate, she paused and glanced back once more. A faint glimmer of sunlight caught the bracelet on Lydia's wrist as she moved in the drawing room, reminding Miss Marple that appearances could both conceal and reveal. Human nature, she thought, was an endlessly fascinating study, and one never truly understood it in a single glance. Returning to her cottage, she set down her basket and poured herself a final cup of tea. Outside, the village moved through its ordinary afternoon, unaware of the subtle, decisive events that had shaped its course. Inside, Miss Marple sat quietly, reflecting on the week's revelations. Justice, she mused, had a quiet elegance when it was served patiently, with careful observation and measured understanding. Willowmere House would remain a memory, the lake a silent witness, and the villagers, no doubt, would continue to speculate. But the truth, finally assembled, coherent and undeniable, had been brought to light. And Miss Marple, as always, sipped her tea and considered the curious, persistent, and endlessly revealing nature of human behaviour. In the village of St. Aldwyn, life would continue, calm on the surface, but forever marked by the events at Willowmere, the wedding night, the argument, the lake, and the widow whose composure concealed a storm. It was a story the village would remember, whisper about, and perhaps embellish over the years. Yet the core of it, the truth, would remain, as enduring and subtle as the lake itself. Tea at 4, Miss Marple thought, was never just tea. It was a moment to reflect, to observe, and to acknowledge that even in the quietest villages, human nature never ceases to intrigue, surprise, and when necessary, reveal justice in its own unassuming way. And with that reflection, she allowed herself a small smile, content in the knowledge that the balance of events, observation, and consequence had for the time being reached its proper conclusion. The lake would lie still, the house would stand silent, and the village, for all its gossip and speculation, would continue, forever touched by the lessons that tragedy, careful observation, and human nature inevitably teach.